The primary driving force behind 20th century geopolitics was ideology, and World War I was the catalyzing factor. After the 1910s saw a devastating struggle between the relatively more democratic nations of the Entente squaring off against the relatively more authoritarian monarchies of the Central Powers, the subsequent rise of communism and fascism led to World War II, and the subsequent Cold War after that between the United States of America and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. World War II, and the Cold War in particular, were ideological at their core. However, towards the end of the Cold War and beyond to the present day, the catalyst for armed conflict has increasingly centered around security control over energy and resources, and for a century now, oil has been that primary source of energy. The world's present hunger and dependence on oil can be traced back to Winston Churchill's fateful decision to push for the UK's Royal Navy to convert to oil in place of coal for energy during World War I. The rest of Europe was quick to follow suit, and since then, oil has played a major role in geopolitics as a resource of high military, domestic, and international importance. The British Isles themselves had no easily accessible large deposits of oil. The nearest oil deposits lay beneath the tumultuous waters of the North Sea, and were completely inaccessible with the technology of the time. Now that the UK relied on oil for a functioning navy, it would have to pursue a more aggressive foreign policy in the Middle East in order to secure a reliable source of oil. In what was likely the first instance where a desire for oil significantly influenced the foreign policy of a major world power, the UK government made the unprecedented move of buying a majority stake in the then-named Anglo-Persian Oil Company. This move motivated the UK to secure territory in the Middle East, and in doing so created the British protectorates of Iraq, Kuwait, Jordan, Bahrain, Qatar, and Oman out of the lands of the defeated Ottoman Empire. The UK's military was now powered by oil, and it was the military that kept the vast British Empire together. Thus, British foreign policy interests shifted to adjust the world's more oil-centric style of geopolitics. Which is not to say that geography had no role to play in international affairs before the 20th century. For example, following the Industrial Revolution that occurred in Britain during the late 18th century and beyond to the 19th, the UK was able to gain an important geopolitical edge by exploiting the natural abundance of coal within the British Isles, particularly in southern Wales and northern England. In much the same way, the member nations of OPEC, and especially the Gulf states, derive most of their geopolitical clout from the fact that they have vast reserves of energy deposits underground, which in their case comes in the form of oil. To this day, oil remains the most easily accessible and reliable form of energy in the world. Even beyond its fuel-related applications, the byproducts of oil remain essential in the production of other important materials such as plastic and nylon that we continue to use on a daily basis. Anyone old enough to remember the 2000s probably also remembers a certain somewhat commonly held mentality regarding the future potential scarcity of oil. There was in fact much international anxiety surrounding the prospect of growing dependence on oil, due to a belief that the world would soon run out of oil. It's rather interesting then that, not even a decade later in 2013, shale oil production transformed the United States into the largest oil producer in the world, in large part due to the tremendous advances in shale oil extraction technology. Fears of running out of oil evaporated due to the realization that as long as demand remains, new innovations in technology will give us increasingly more efficient methods of oil extraction that will increase our oil supply. Even as far as the 1970s, during the Carter administration, fears of a finite oil supply ran so high that President Carter himself urged Americans to conserve oil whenever possible. This mentality dominated the 1970s, but when new sources of oil were discovered in the 80s and 90s, this belief receded in the minds of the general public. The rest of this video series will explore the new balance of power between OPEC and the rest of the world after the shale revolution. In particular, I seek to answer if whether or not the fracking revolution and increase in shale oil production will significantly reduce OPEC's market dominance and political influence, and how the Gulf states will respond to the decreasing appetite for oil from the rest of the world, especially the United States. I will also analyze how the Gulf states have used their abundant oil supply to leverage a geopolitical advantage, and if they will continue to remain politically relevant without it in the decades to come. The next part of this video series will examine the history of OPEC and its impact on the oil market, while Part 3 will briefly discuss the process of fracking and its successful implementation. Parts 4, 5, and 6 will examine cases and examples that support my own personal hypothesis that OPEC's market dominance and political influence will ultimately wane due to the fracking revolution. Next, Part 7 examines the growing popularity of renewable energy and the increased energy independence of large oil importing companies due to advances in shale extraction technology. Part 8 discusses how Gulf states plan to diversify their economies to survive in a world without oil as a major geopolitical factor. Part 9 focuses on the threats that OPEC faces from within the organization that may end up fracturing the cartel over diverging interests. Parts 10 and 11 will discuss how OPEC can remain relevant as the world slowly transitions away from oil, as well as the consequences of peak oil demand and the COVID-19 pandemic's impact on the oil markets. Finally, the last part of this video series analyzes how geopolitics in the Middle East will evolve as a result of the impact of fracking and the shale oil revolution on OPEC and the unity of its member countries. So stay tuned for more.